Hey guys, tonight we wander into the warm, sun-soaked halls of Alexandria, where the scent of incense mingles with the distant salt of the Mediterranean. You probably won't survive this if you expect a boring history lesson, because we're about to traipse alongside Cleopatra herself in the final days of her reign. You wander through the echoing corridors of her palace, your footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, your hand brushing against golden railings that seem almost too heavy for the delicate touch of one ruler. Somewhere beyond the marble pillars, the Nile flows lazily, glinting like molten silver, carrying whispers of rebellion, romance, and a world teetering on the brink of conquest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, comment below with your location and what time it is locally. Let's see where in the world we're nudging into Cleopatra's intimate chambers tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drift deeper into the palace, feeling the warmth of the late afternoon sun spilling through tall windows. The scent of crushed herbs hangs in the air, mingling with the faint tang of the sea. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra's influence was as sweeping as legend claims or if much of her aura was carefully curated image, but for now, you don't need to worry about that. You're simply observing, feeling the pulse of Alexandria in its final, tense days. The city outside hums faintly, a mixture of merchants calling their wares, donkeys clattering over cobblestones, and the occasional laugh of children chasing each other through the narrow streets. Cleopatra, poised in her private chamber, watches it all through a high window, her eyes tracing the sails of ships on the Nile. You notice the subtle tilt of her head, the curl of a finger as she lifts a small, ornate fan, a gesture that is simultaneously casual and commanding. Oddly enough, she seems to keep a small collection of exotic birds in the room, though scholars argue whether these were purely decorative or a form of personal amusement. Right now, one golden canary hops between her fingers, chirping a surprisingly melancholy tune, and you can't help but imagine her humming along softly to it. As you wander closer to her, you notice the layers of fabrics, each dyed with colors so rich you feel a little guilty for ever thinking purple was just a color. Purple was power, wealth, and prestige, and Cleopatra wore it like a second skin. Odd detail. She apparently favored a particular shade derived from sea snails, a hue so expensive that wearing it was basically a public announcement of one's political clout. You step lightly, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of silk and jewelry scattered across the floor, each piece more intricate than the last. The air shifts slightly as a messenger enters, bearing a scroll sealed with the unmistakable mark of Antony. You feel the weight of history pressing around you, and in your mind, you imagine Cleopatra breaking the wax seal, unfurling the papyrus with practiced grace. There's a certain tension in the room, the kind that makes your eyelids heavy, not from boredom, but from the slow, creeping realization that time itself seems suspended here. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra's correspondence with Antony was filled more with genuine emotion or cunning political strategy, but at this moment, you sense a mixture of both. The sun continues to dip, bathing the room in a soft, golden haze. Cleopatra steps onto a balcony overlooking the Nile, and you follow her gaze. Ships drift lazily, some adorned with colorful banners, others simple, utilitarian vessels carrying grains and goods. Oddly, the palace cats slink around the balcony edges, ignoring the humans completely, as if the entire scene is just part of their daily stroll. You notice one particularly bold feline, tail high, watching a small group of servants below rearranging amphorae. You can't help but smile at the thought that even in such a politically charged environment, life's little absurdities continue. Inside, a scholar's debate hums quietly in your imagination. Some insist Cleopatra was primarily a shrewd political operator, others, a genuinely visionary leader. You listen to the imagined arguments as you wander along the colonnades, brushing against warm stone. The air carries faint notes of myrrh and roses, details often overlooked in dry historical accounts, but which you now notice, almost hypnotically. Cleopatra moves through these scents with an almost ritualistic awareness, pausing occasionally to adjust a statue or tilt a mirror, reminding you that even in the shadow of conquest, beauty mattered immensely. Oddly enough, She has a penchant for little theatrics that seem almost mundane to an observer but were strategic in nature. For instance, she apparently had a set of perfumed gloves she wore only when expecting particularly influential visitors, something scholars still debate the significance of. Was it genuine vanity, subtle intimidation, or a mix of both? You watch as she lifts one glove, inhaling its scent in a moment of quiet reflection, and you feel strangely comforted by this simple human gesture amid monumental events. As dusk deepens, the palace begins to settle into its nocturnal rhythm. Servants whisper quietly in corridors, water drips somewhere in a distant fountain, and the golden light fades into the soft blues and purples of early evening. You follow Cleopatra as she moves toward her private chambers, guided by candlelight flickering against mosaics depicting gods, pharaohs, and mythic beasts. She pauses briefly by a small pool, tossing a coin and watching the ripples fan out, an oddly calming gesture, humanizing the ruler who will soon be remembered for empire-shaping decisions. You notice the faint sound of a lyre somewhere behind a screen, someone practicing in private, fingers gliding over strings in a tune that seems both playful and melancholic. Odd detail. Cleopatra is said to have personally enjoyed music during tense political moments, claiming it steadied her mind. You imagine her swaying slightly to the rhythm, a queen conducting an orchestra of shadows and whispers, and feel a strange sense of intimacy, as though you are witnessing a side of history rarely preserved. Night finally falls, and Alexandria shifts from bustling city to dreamlike silence. The soft lapping of the Nile replaces the earlier chorus of merchants and children. Torches flicker along streets, casting dancing shadows, while the palace itself seems to exhale, settling into the night. Cleopatra retreats to a chamber rich with silks, her gaze lingering briefly on a small collection of scrolls, maps, letters, and perhaps even some unfinished plans. You sense the weight of decisions yet to be made, the pressure of events still unfolding beyond these walls. You feel almost drowsy as you watch her, the palace sounds blending into a gentle hum, your mind tracing the contours of history, conjecture, and rumor. Cleopatra is both larger than life and intimately human, her power, her quirks, her rituals, all forming a tapestry you are privileged to observe from this quiet vantage point. Scholars still argue about the exact dynamics of her relationships, her decisions in the final days, and even the subtle messages encoded in her gestures, but for now, you are simply present, witnessing the twilight of a queen. Finally, as the stars emerge above Alexandria, you feel the night folding around you like a soft, velvet cloak. Cleopatra lights a single lamp in her chamber, its glow casting gentle warmth across the floor. You linger in the quiet, letting the events, colors, and scents of the palace seep into your imagination. And somewhere in the distance, the golden canary chirps one last, delicate note before settling for the night. You feel a gentle tug toward sleep, your mind cradled by history, oddities, and the slow, serene rhythm of the Nile outside. You drift further into the soft, golden haze of Alexandria, feeling the subtle tension that hangs over the city like a thick, fragrant curtain. The shadow of Rome stretches long across the Mediterranean, and you can almost sense it pressing against the walls of Cleopatra's palace, brushing against her carefully arranged perfumes and golden ornaments. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra truly feared Octavian or if she played the threat like a masterful game of chess. You wander alongside her now, imagining the queen as she paces the private halls, each step measured, deliberate, yet tinged with a restless energy. Outside, the city is quieter than you expected. Merchants have retreated into their homes, street performers are folding up their props, and the gulls above wheel lazily, their cries softened by distance. Yet beneath this sleepy exterior, you feel the undercurrent of political anxiety, news carried on winds, rumors whispered in shadowed corners, the subtle echo of distant Roman ambitions. Cleopatra senses it all, and somehow, in this delicate tension, there is an intimacy that draws you closer, as though you are sharing her private awareness of a world about to tip into chaos. You wander toward a balcony overlooking the harbor, the water a reflective silver as the sun dips further. Ships drift in and out of the dock, some carrying grain, some merchants, goods, and a few, oddly, displaying the faint scarlet banners of Roman authority. Oddly enough, Cleopatra has an unusual habit of watching these banners with a mix of curiosity and irritation, as if they were tiny, annoying insects crawling across the expanse of her dominion. You lean over the railing with her, feeling the warm breeze on your skin, imagining the gentle sway of the ships and the soft slap of water against wood. The shadow of Rome is more than banners and ships, it is the weight of inevitability. Octavian's reputation precedes him. A calculated, relentless figure whose ambition seems almost mechanical. You sense Cleopatra considering every possible angle, every message to Antony, every potential alliance, as if she is playing a mental game of Go with the future itself. Scholars still debate whether she overestimated Octavian or underestimated him, and in your quiet observation, you feel that perhaps both are true at once. Inside the palace, Cleopatra moves with an economy of gestures, yet each motion carries meaning. She adjusts the placement of a golden vase, smooths the folds of a rug, lifts a delicate piece of jewelry to the light. Small actions, perhaps, but imbued with careful intention. Odd detail. She reportedly had a tiny, portable mirror made of polished obsidian, which she carried even on the shortest walks across the palace. You imagine her peering into it now, checking her reflection as much for reassurance as vanity, a subtle defiance in the face of encroaching power. You hear distant footsteps echoing through the marble corridors. Courtiers move like shadows, whispering with soft, urgent tones. Cleopatra stops momentarily to glance at a nearby scroll. Her eyes flick over the inked letters, deciphering the news from Antony, from Roman envoys, from the undercurrent of her city itself. It's almost hypnotic, watching her work through these tiny threads of information, the tapestry of war, politics, and personal relationships unfurling before you. Scholars still argue whether her intelligence network was more myth than reality, but as you follow her gaze, the lines between legend and fact blur deliciously. The sun continues its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of lavender and rose. Alexandria seems to exhale in tandem with the light, the city's rhythm slowing as evening approaches. Cleopatra steps onto a small terrace, letting the warm breeze carry the scent of jasmine and salt. Oddly, she has a fondness for letting her hair flow freely during these moments, despite the strict fashions of the court. You watch her, feeling a peculiar comfort in these minor rebellions against expectation, the quiet intimacy of shared observation without intrusion. Her thoughts drift to Antony, and you sense the strain of their entwined fates. He is both her ally and her potential undoing, his presence a constant reminder of the Roman threat, yet also the source of fleeting, human comfort. You imagine the letters she writes him, folding them carefully, sealing them with wax, and perhaps adding a playful flourish or secret symbol only he would understand. Odd detail. Cleopatra reportedly used a unique scent on some letters to ensure Antony could identify them at a glance, a subtle but intimate code. As twilight deepens, you wander into a quieter wing of the palace, where the faint sound of water trickling from a fountain mixes with the soft murmur of servants moving about. Cleopatra pauses by a small pool, tossing a coin into the gentle ripples, watching the rings expand slowly. You notice the quiet precision in her movements, a small ritual perhaps meant to calm nerves, perhaps simply to mark time. Scholars still debate whether such acts were purely symbolic or had genuine ritual significance, and you find yourself caught in the soothing rhythm of the unknown. The faint flicker of torchlight illuminates mosaics depicting battles, gods, and pharaohs of the past. You linger over the images, imagining the weight of history pressing down on Cleopatra's shoulders. Oddly, she seems to regard them not with reverence but with subtle amusement, perhaps noticing small inaccuracies or enjoying the artistry. You can almost hear a quiet chuckle escape her lips, though it is swallowed by the soft hum of the palace settling into night. Rome's shadow grows longer as darkness falls, stretching across the harbor, creeping along the streets, and pressing gently against the palace gates. Cleopatra moves through the corridors with the calm precision of someone used to living under constant scrutiny, yet you notice the small human hesitations, the pause before speaking to a messenger, the careful glance toward a hidden window, the subtle tightening of her fingers on a scroll. It is these little, fleeting moments that make her both legendary and achingly human. You follow her as she retreats to a smaller chamber, lit only by a single lamp whose flame flickers in the cool evening air. The quiet hum of the city outside, the distant lap of waves against the docks, and the occasional whisper of a servant create a gentle, lulling symphony. Cleopatra sits at a low table, brushing her hair, reviewing notes, and letting her mind wander briefly to personal pleasures, a favorite perfume, a quiet song, or the comfort of a small, trusted confidant. Odd detail. She reportedly had a favorite scented ointment made from rose, myrrh, and a hint of cinnamon, which she used during contemplative moments. You imagine inhaling it vicariously, feeling the soothing calm that must have accompanied such indulgence. The night deepens, and Alexandria becomes a quiet dreamscape. The palace seems to breathe with a life of its own, its shadows stretching and folding like soft fabric. Cleopatra rises and moves to a balcony, gazing at the stars reflected in the Nile. You follow her gaze, the vast, dark water stretching endlessly, dotted with small lanterns from distant ships. Scholars still debate whether she truly foresaw the end coming or lived in a state of perpetual hope, but in this soft, lullaby-like night, it hardly matters. You feel the gentle pull of sleep, carried by the serene cadence of history, wind, and water. Finally, you linger in the corridor just behind her, watching as she leans lightly on the balcony railing. The cool night breeze brushes your skin, the faint scent of salt and jasmine mingling in the air. Octavian's shadow looms large in the world beyond these walls, but here, in this intimate slice of Alexandria, the queen seems almost untouchable, her presence calm, her mind sharp, her rituals quietly defiant. And as you feel your eyelids grow heavy, the gentle hush of the city, the flickering lamp, and the soft ripple of the Nile carry you toward a drowsy, reflective peace. You follow Cleopatra through the palace corridors, each step echoing softly against the marble, feeling the invisible weight of history pressing in from every corner. The scent of incense lingers in the air, mingling with faint traces of honeyed wine and the salt of the nearby Mediterranean. Outside, Alexandria sleeps uneasily, its streets quieter now, save for the occasional distant splash of a boat against the docks. And then there's Antony, Mark Antony, the man whose moods and fortunes have become inseparable from the fate of the queen herself. Tonight, you walk beside him in spirit, trailing his declining star, observing the slow unraveling of a man both brilliant and deeply flawed. You imagine him sitting in a dimly lit chamber, his armor set aside, a goblet of wine in hand. Scholars still argue whether Antony's despair after the defeat at Actium was due to strategic miscalculations, betrayal by his own commanders, or simply an inflated sense of theatrical tragedy. Oddly, he seems incapable of doing anything quietly, even his grief carries a dramatic flourish. You picture him tossing a small, ornately carved chair across the room for emphasis, then immediately regretting it, rubbing his temples while Cleopatra watches with a mix of amusement and exasperation. His relationship with Cleopatra has always been a dance of power, desire, and theatricality, and tonight is no different. You imagine her approaching him cautiously, steps soft against the polished stone floor, a hand hovering lightly over his shoulder before settling to steady him. Odd detail. Antony reportedly had a pet monkey that he treated almost like a counselor, bringing it to meetings and even letting it approve some of his letters to Cleopatra. You can almost hear the soft chittering of the creature in the corner, a small absurdity amid monumental events. The defeat at Actium still hangs over him, an invisible storm cloud that even the calm of Alexandria cannot dissipate. Ships lost, sailors scattered, and yet Antony cannot help but dwell on the theatrical nature of the loss. He insists that the winds were against him, that betrayal lurked in every corner, yet scholars debate whether his failures were purely external or simply the result of overconfidence and indulgence. You watch him pour another goblet of wine, swirling it, inhaling the bouquet, and you realize that even in decline, there is a strange sort of brilliance in the man, a flair for drama that somehow keeps you mesmerized rather than frustrated. Cleopatra, ever perceptive, knows how to temper his moods. She walks beside him now, letting her presence calm the tempestuous waves of his temper. You notice the subtle ways she draws him back from his spirals. A quiet question, a soft touch, a shared glance that speaks volumes without words. Oddly, she has a habit of leaving small, folded notes around his chambers, tiny scrolls with advice, reminders, or sometimes cryptic jokes. Scholars still argue whether these were meant primarily to influence Antony politically or simply to maintain a fragile connection amid chaos. The palace itself seems to mirror Antony's mood, rooms dimly lit, shadows stretching across intricate mosaics, corridors winding in unexpected ways. You drift alongside him, feeling the sense of history pressing into your chest, imagining his frustration as he contemplates strategies, lost opportunities, and the relentless advance of Octavian. Odd detail. Antony reportedly kept a collection of ceremonial swords, each representing a different campaign or victory, and he would sometimes arrange them on the floor as if mapping his life's trajectory. You imagine him staring at them now, tracing invisible lines, sighing, and shaking his head. Even in his moments of despair, Antony exhibits flashes of charm and charisma that make him unforgettable. He paces slowly, gesturing with one hand while the other clutches a letter from Cleopatra, the wax seal cracked but the words inside still resonant. Scholars still argue whether his attachment to Cleopatra was purely political, purely emotional, or an intricate combination of both. You sense the tension in the room, a kind of electricity that hums softly, blending the fading sunlight with the flickering lamplight, creating a liminal space between reality and legend. Outside, the evening settles over Alexandria with a gentle sigh. The streets grow quieter, the water of the Nile glints faintly in the moonlight, and the occasional flicker of a torch carries distant shadows along the harbor. You imagine Antony pausing by a window, watching the reflection of the moon on the water, feeling both lost and oddly tethered to the world by Cleopatra's silent presence nearby. Odd detail. He reportedly had a small bronze figurine of a Roman general he would consult when making difficult decisions, almost like a miniature, stoic advisor. You picture it now, catching the lamplight, an absurd yet comforting companion amid the turbulence of war and politics. Cleopatra moves closer, her steps measured and calm, contrasting sharply with Antony's restless pacing. She touches his arm lightly, a grounding presence, whispering something only he can hear. You almost hear her say, "The world does not end tonight," though in truth, she knows the stakes are infinitely higher. Scholars still debate whether her interventions calmed Antony or simply delayed the inevitable. You feel neither conclusion nor judgment here, only the gentle ebb and flow of human connection against the tide of history. The night stretches on, and Antony's theatrics gradually soften into quiet reflection. He sinks into a cushioned chair, eyes distant, fingers drumming softly against the armrest. Oddly, he keeps a small collection of perfumes nearby, myrrh, frankincense, and a faint hint of rose, to soothe himself after particularly difficult news. You imagine him inhaling deeply, the scents mingling with the warm, muted light of the chamber, grounding him momentarily in the present. Cleopatra remains near, occasionally adjusting the placement of a small lamp or gently straightening the folds of his cloak. Time seems suspended. Outside, the Nile murmurs softly, waves lapping against the docks, the city's nocturnal rhythm barely perceptible. You watch Antony's eyes soften, his shoulders relax, and you feel the intimate tension of two people bound together by politics, love, and the inexorable weight of history. Oddly, despite the chaos and despair, there is a small, almost imperceptible sense of ritual in his behavior, carefully lighting candles, arranging letters, consulting his bronze figurine, all acts that soothe his mind even as the world conspires against him. Cleopatra eventually leads him toward a quieter chamber, where soft cushions and delicate lamps await. She gestures for him to sit, and you imagine him sinking into the comfort with a faint sigh, the subtle tension of his body easing just slightly. Scholars still argue about the nature of his attachment to Cleopatra, whether he was captivated by her intellect, her charm, or simply the desperation of circumstance, but at this moment, none of that matters. You are simply present, observing the human fragility of a man once larger than life, now slowly retreating into intimacy and quiet reflection. Oddly, Antony keeps a small, folded note from Cleopatra in his hand, rubbing it between his fingers absent-mindedly. The soft hum of the city outside, the gentle flicker of lamp light, the muted aroma of incense and perfume, all converge into a hypnotic lull that begins to cradle your own senses. You notice the faint curl of Antony's lips, the almost imperceptible relaxation of his posture, and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of someone letting the world soften around him. As night deepens, you imagine Antony leaning back, closing his eyes, and allowing himself a few stolen moments of peace. Cleopatra remains nearby, a quiet sentinel, her presence grounding him in ways history will never fully record. Odd detail. He reportedly had a penchant for reciting poetry softly to himself when particularly troubled, a practice that scholars still argue was either therapeutic or merely performative. You hear the faint rhythm of imagined verses, a lullaby of sorts, blending seamlessly with the gentle night sounds outside the palace. Finally, you step back, letting the scene linger in your imagination. Antony's brilliance, his flaws, his quirks, all woven together into the tapestry of a man whose star is fading yet still flickers in intimate, human ways. Cleopatra's quiet interventions, her presence, and her subtle rituals provide contrast, reminding you that even amid decline and tension, there is room for connection, charm, and gentle moments of absurdity. The palace, the Nile, the stars overhead, they all seem to hold their breath, carrying you softly toward sleep, carrying Antony's lingering drama into a dreamlike twilight. You wander deeper into the palace, feeling the hushed echoes of whispered conversations bouncing off the marble walls. The air is thick with a mix of incense, faint perfume, and the quiet tension of intrigue that clings to every corner. Cleopatra moves ahead of you, her steps measured, confident, yet soft enough to leave no trace. You sense that even in these private halls, every gesture carries weight. Every glance, every tilt of her head, every careful placement of an object could ripple outward in ways only she truly understands. Scholars still argue whether her influence over the court was absolute or carefully cultivated perception, but right now, you don't need certainty. You only need to notice the subtle rhythms of palace life, the murmurs and glances that fill the space like a soft, constant background hum. The court itself is a living organism. Servants and officials move like shadows, their conversations quiet yet loaded with significance. Oddly, you notice a small detail. A court scribe has apparently trained a tiny bird to deliver short messages across the corridors. Its high-pitched chirps punctuate the soft murmurs of human voices, a whimsical yet strangely effective form of communication. You can't help but smile at the thought that even in the midst of politics, small absurdities continue to exist, unnoticed by the more serious players. Cleopatra pauses by a column, listening intently as two of her advisors murmur over a map of naval movements. You lean closer in your imagination, noting the tension in their voices, the subtle shifts in posture, the way one hand rests lightly on a dagger, just in case. Oddly, these advisors seem almost like chess pieces, each move calculated, each word measured, yet human flaws seep in. A nervous glance, a suppressed cough, a hint of impatience. Scholars still debate how much Cleopatra orchestrated versus simply responded, but as you watch, the interplay of strategy and instinct feels hypnotically alive. A messenger slips through the hall, bearing a folded letter sealed with the insignia of Octavian himself. You watch as Cleopatra takes it, her fingers brushing lightly against the wax seal, inspecting it with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and calculated amusement. Odd detail. She reportedly had a method of subtly altering the wax to leave tiny fingerprints only she could recognize, an early form of cryptographic security. You sense her mind already weighing possibilities, reading not only the words but the tone, the pressure of the letters, the tiny hints of diplomacy hidden in each fold. The palace seems to pulse with quiet life around you. Servants hurry along narrow corridors carrying trays of food and water, whispering to each other about rumors that may or may not be true. Cleopatra listens with a soft, knowing smile, nodding occasionally as if to say, "Yes, I know more than you imagine." Scholars still argue whether her awareness of court gossip was genuine or the result of clever orchestration, but to you, it feels intimate, almost like watching a conductor gently guide an orchestra without a single raised baton. You drift into the private quarters, where Cleopatra meets a small group of trusted confidants. Their conversation is muted, filled with the careful, deliberate tones of planning and strategy. Oddly, one of the men absent-mindedly taps a small bronze figurine on the table, a lucky charm he swears has predicted military victories. You can almost hear Cleopatra suppress a laugh, her fingers grazing the edge of a golden chalice as she listens. Scholars still debate how much superstition influenced her decision-making, but the human touch in these moments is undeniable, a soft counterpoint to the tension of impending conquest. The night grows deeper, and the palace corridors seem to shrink around you, wrapping you in warmth, shadow, and history. Cleopatra moves from room to room, her presence a quiet tether holding the chaos at bay. Oddly, she has a habit of sprinkling dried rose petals along the floor, a ritual some suggest was meant to inspire calm or perhaps subtly impress visitors with her refined tastes. You notice the petals, faint aroma mixing with the heavier scent of incense, creating a soft sensory tapestry that carries you forward, gently coaxing your attention along the thread of her movements. She pauses briefly by a window overlooking the Nile. The water glimmers with silver under the moonlight, faint ripples breaking against the docked ships. You sense her mind wandering, calculating, weighing options that may decide the fate of kingdoms. Scholars still argue whether she viewed Octavian as a negotiable threat or an unstoppable force, and whether her political acumen was genius or sheer audacity. You watch her trace patterns in the moonlight with her fingers, perhaps imagining alternate histories, shifts in allegiance, and paths not yet taken. The court's whispers continue around you. You hear a servant quietly arguing with a guard over a missed delivery of scrolls, another voice muttering about an unexpected visitor in the outer garden. Oddly, Cleopatra seems attuned to every minor disturbance, aware of details that would escape most observers. You imagine her noting the cadence of each voice, the slight hesitation in each step, and the subtle gestures that betray intention. It is like watching a spider delicately sense vibrations in its web, calm, precise, and deadly effective. You drift closer as she turns back to her chamber, picking up a small, intricately carved perfume jar. Odd detail. Cleopatra is said to have kept dozens of these jars, each containing unique blends of myrrh, frankincense, and rare flower oils. You imagine her inhaling deeply, letting the scents settle her mind, grounding her in the moment while she navigates the endless, delicate negotiations of power. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were purely sensory indulgences or subtle tools of psychological strategy, perhaps both at once. The palace settles into a rhythm, a gentle pulse of muted conversations, distant fountains, and flickering candlelight. You follow Cleopatra as she moves to a quiet alcove, examining a series of miniature statues depicting various gods and ancestors. Oddly, she seems almost playful with them, repositioning a figure here, tilting another there, as if arranging her own personal pantheon for aesthetic and symbolic purposes. Scholars still debate how much symbolism governed her public and private spaces, but to you, the intimacy of her small gestures is mesmerizing, a lullaby of quiet control and personal ritual. You notice the way she pauses mid-step to glance at the palace ceiling, following a carved pattern that traces ancient stories. Oddly, she seems to find subtle humor in the intricacies, a private joke hidden in the folds of stone and gold. You sense her mind simultaneously calculating strategy, monitoring her court, and indulging in these tiny, private pleasures, a balance of the monumental and the intimate that feels almost hypnotic. The night deepens further. You drift along with her as she approaches a small indoor garden, the faint scent of jasmine and lotus blossoms mingling with the rich aroma of the palace incense. Oddly, she has a tiny fountain shaped like a sphinx, the water trickling in perfect rhythm. You can almost hear her soft footsteps against the stone, a quiet counterpoint to the gurgling water, carrying you gently into a world where intrigue and beauty coexist seamlessly. Scholars still argue how much her gardens reflected political symbolism versus personal enjoyment, but at this moment, you are not concerned with the debate. You are simply following, quietly observing, letting the palace and Cleopatra's subtle rituals lull you into calm. Cleopatra sits on a low stone bench, eyes wandering across the flowers, her mind undoubtedly running through endless contingencies. Oddly, she plucks a small bloom, inhaling its fragrance, holding it delicately between her fingers. Scholars still argue whether these moments of quiet contemplation were strategic, meditative, or simply indulgent. You feel yourself drawn into the softness of the night, the gentle interplay of shadows, fragrance, and whispered conversations wrapping around you like a soft blanket. Finally, you step back slightly, letting her presence fill the space without intrusion. The palace hums with life and secrecy, the corridors alive with subtle drama, minor absurdities, and whispered schemes. Cleopatra's quiet authority, her playful indulgences, and the court's careful choreography create a hypnotic rhythm that carries you toward a gentle, reflective state. The night is vast, yet intimate, each shadow, whisper, and candle flame adding to the delicate tapestry that is Alexandria in the final days of Cleopatra's reign. You drift through the palace corridors, now bathed in the soft silver glow of moonlight filtering through high windows. The marble underfoot is cool, almost slick, and the faint scent of jasmine and incense lingers, mixing with the subtle warmth of the stone walls. Cleopatra moves ahead of you, her movements deliberate and graceful, yet there is an undercurrent of tension in her steps that speaks of looming decisions and the relentless weight of expectation. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra's composure during these moments was absolute control or a masterful illusion, but for now, you are content to observe, letting the rhythm of her palace-bound world wash over you. You wander into a private chamber lined with scrolls and manuscripts, the smell of aged papyrus filling the air. Oddly, she seems to treat some of these documents almost like talismans, running her fingers gently over the edges as if touching the past could influence the future. You watch as she pauses at a particular scroll, the text detailing the political alliances of neighboring kingdoms. Scholars still debate the exact nature of Cleopatra's diplomatic network, whether she relied on charm, strategic marriages, or sheer cunning, but you sense that all these elements were at play, woven seamlessly into her daily routines. The night outside is quiet, punctuated only by the distant lap of waves along the Nile and the occasional flutter of a bird settling for sleep. Cleopatra traces a finger along a miniature map of Alexandria, eyes narrowing as she calculates the paths of supply ships, the timing of Roman patrols, and the movements of Antony's forces. Oddly, she has a habit of marking these maps with tiny, coded symbols, visible only to her and perhaps one trusted aide. You notice the precision, the care, and the almost obsessive attention to detail, and you realize that even in her quietest moments, she is thinking many steps ahead. Her mind drifts briefly to Antony, and you sense the intertwined threads of personal affection and political necessity. He is both her partner and a variable she must constantly account for, a presence that can either stabilize or destabilize the precarious balance of power. Oddly, Antony's penchant for dramatic gestures, throwing himself into despair, performing for effect, seems to amuse her privately, a tiny human quirk in a world dominated by strategy. Scholars still debate how much Cleopatra's emotional intelligence shaped their alliance, and how much was merely tactical, but you can see the subtle interplay, the quiet negotiations of trust and understanding, unfolding in real time. The palace hums with life around you, though it is a muted, gentle rhythm. Servants move quietly along corridors, carrying trays of water or rearranging cushions in preparation for late-night councils. Oddly, one of the pages carries a small, carved figurine of a cat, claiming it will bring luck to the household. You notice Cleopatra glancing at it, a faint, private smile tugging at her lips. Scholars still argue whether these small rituals were superstitious indulgences or intentional psychological tools, but for you, they are mesmerizing glimpses into the intimacy of daily life in the palace. A messenger enters with a sealed letter, bearing news from Octavian's camp. You watch as Cleopatra examines it carefully, the soft flicker of candlelight highlighting the subtle arch of her brow. Oddly, she doesn't open it immediately. Instead, she weighs it in her hands, turning it gently, perhaps imagining the implications of its contents before confronting reality. Scholars still debate whether these moments of hesitation were strategic, symbolic, or purely human, but you sense the deliberate patience in every gesture, the kind that only someone accustomed to navigating constant danger could master. The corridors beyond are lined with mosaics depicting gods, battles, and legendary rulers. You pause to study them alongside Cleopatra, noticing the way she tilts her head slightly, as if comparing herself to the figures frozen in stone. Oddly, she seems to find subtle humor in certain depictions, tiny quirks overlooked by most observers. You sense her private amusement, a quiet acknowledgement that even the grandest displays of power contain imperfections, just as human rulers do. Scholars still debate how much Cleopatra engaged with symbolic imagery for herself versus her audience, and you are content to watch the ambiguity play out softly in the candlelight. Night deepens further, and you wander into an inner courtyard where a small fountain trickles, the water catching the moonlight in delicate sparkles. Cleopatra sits on the low edge, lifting a single rose from a nearby bush and inhaling its fragrance. Oddly, she seems to find reassurance in these small, sensory pleasures, a tactile reminder of beauty and calm amid the storm of political pressures. Scholars still argue whether such moments were deliberate methods of stress relief or personal indulgences, but you sense their hypnotic power, a gentle lull that pulls your own attention and breath into quiet focus. The palace cats, oblivious to the weight of empires, slip silently through the courtyard, brushing against legs and vanishing into shadows. You notice one particularly bold feline leaping to the fountain's edge, staring down at the water as though meditating on the world's mysteries. Oddly, Cleopatra seems entertained rather than annoyed, watching the creature with a light chuckle and a brief flick of her fingers, sending it darting along the marble. Scholars still debate the significance of pets in royal life, but you feel the quiet joy of witnessing small, undisturbed rituals amidst monumental events. Cleopatra rises, moving back inside toward a chamber filled with musical instruments, lyres, flutes, and small percussion. Oddly, she picks up a lyre, plucking a few notes with delicate fingers, letting the sound linger softly in the air. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra personally performed music for entertainment, diplomacy, or personal meditation, but you feel the gentle intimacy of the moment, the soft vibration of strings blending with the muted hum of the palace, carrying a subtle comfort through the corridors. You drift with her into a private lounge where cushions are arranged in clusters, soft rugs underfoot. Oddly, she has a small collection of scented oils and powders, each chosen with care. Scholars still debate whether Cleopatra used these for ceremonial purposes, personal ritual, or simply aesthetic pleasure, but the blend of aroma, myrrh, frankincense, faint hints of rose, creates a gentle cocoon around you, drawing attention away from the political tension that lingers in every corner of the city. A small lamp flickers in the corner, casting gentle shadows that play across the walls. Cleopatra leans back on a cushion, reviewing correspondence from her advisors and allies. Oddly, she seems to smile at certain letters, a subtle amusement born of wit, irony, or perhaps the absurdities of diplomacy. Scholars still argue about the content and tone of her communications, but you are absorbed not in the details, only in the hypnotic cadence of her life. Correspondence, ritual, observation, reflection, a soft, continuous rhythm that gently pulls you along. Outside, the city rests under a moonlit sky, the Nile shimmering faintly, ships gently rocking at the docks. Cleopatra glances toward the horizon, eyes tracing distant lights that may signify Rome's presence, or perhaps only merchant vessels. Oddly, she seems calm, a quiet mastery in her stance, a subtle blend of patience, calculation, and human vulnerability. Scholars still debate whether her calm in these moments reflected true foresight or controlled poise, but you feel the soothing rhythm nonetheless, a hypnotic interplay of history, power, and small, intimate moments. Finally, you step back slightly, allowing her presence and rituals to envelop you without intrusion. The palace hums with life and shadow, whispers and gentle sounds of water, candles flickering softly against the walls. Cleopatra's movements, small gestures, and quiet habits create a tapestry that is at once human, strategic, and strangely mesmerizing. You feel the soft pull of sleep, carried by the hypnotic cadence of moonlight, fragrance, and distant ripples on the Nile, a gentle lull that will guide you through the rest of this intimate journey. You drift further into the palace, where the faint hum of nocturnal life intertwines with the soft trickle of fountains and the distant lap of the Nile. Cleopatra's presence anchors you, her movements quiet but purposeful, a delicate counterpoint to the faint tension threading through the palace. Scholars still argue whether her calm demeanor in these late-night hours was strategic discipline or natural temperament, but right now, you are content simply to watch, following the rhythm of her subtle gestures and the soft echo of her footfalls. A gentle breeze flows through an open window, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the distant aroma of salted water. Oddly, Cleopatra has an unusual habit of pausing whenever a breeze touches her hair, letting it cascade over her shoulders in a fleeting, private indulgence. You watch, feeling the hypnotic pull of her subtle rituals, the small human comforts she allows herself even amid looming crises. Scholars still debate how much Cleopatra's personal habits influenced her public image, but for now, her tiny indulgences are mesmerizing, almost lullaby-like in their repetition. She moves toward a chamber filled with art, mosaics, and sculptures, each piece meticulously arranged. Oddly, some sculptures are intentionally placed slightly askew, reportedly to challenge visitors' perceptions or perhaps simply to amuse herself. You wander alongside her gaze, imagining the private amusement she must feel at the subtle distortions. Scholars still argue whether these choices were psychological strategy or aesthetic preference, but in this quiet space, you sense both, woven together in seamless harmony. Cleopatra examines a mosaic depicting a naval battle, fingers lightly tracing the lines of tiny ships and soldiers frozen in stone. Oddly, she reportedly added small secret symbols to some mosaics, messages only she and her closest aides would understand. You lean closer in your imagination, feeling the thrill of decoding her hidden intentions, the way human ingenuity intertwines with artistry. Scholars still debate the exact purpose of these subtle details, but their presence adds a whisper of intimacy to the grand, public image she cultivates. The night outside deepens. Alexandria sleeps, though shadows shift along the streets and rooftops. Cleopatra pauses at a balcony, gazing at the silver sheen of the Nile. Oddly, she seems to have a favorite reflection in the water, tilting her head just so, catching a flicker of moonlight that dances across the ripples. Scholars still argue whether her fascination with reflections was symbolic, aesthetic, or simply playful, but you feel the quiet hypnotic pull of the moment, the gentle cadence of rippling water carrying you softly along. Inside, the palace hums with soft, human activity, servants moving quietly along corridors, distant footsteps echoing against marble floors, whispered exchanges about plans, letters, or minor mishaps. Oddly, one servant carries a small, decorated box, claiming it contains a lucky charm. Cleopatra glances at it with a faint smile, appreciating both its whimsy and the comfort it brings. Scholars still debate the influence of superstition in her court, but the tiny rituals and charms add texture, intimacy, and subtle humor to the night. You drift into a chamber filled with letters, maps, and reports. Cleopatra picks up a small stack, running her fingers over the edges. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged letters by subtle cues, color of wax, thickness of parchment, or even scent, to indicate priority. Scholars still argue whether this was purely practical or a psychological technique to exert subtle control, but you sense the quiet, meticulous intelligence behind every gesture, the hypnotic rhythm of thought made tangible in everyday actions. The palace walls seem to close around you, not oppressively, but with the warmth of living history. Cleopatra moves with calm precision, pausing briefly by a small table where a glass of water waits. Oddly, she reportedly added a drop of perfumed oil to her water during these quiet nights, an indulgence both sensory and symbolic. Scholars still argue whether these personal rituals were primarily aesthetic, meditative, or symbolic, but for you, they create a gentle hypnotic layer to the nocturnal rhythm of her life. You follow her into a chamber lined with musical instruments. Cleopatra picks up a small lyre, plucking a few notes that float softly into the air. Oddly, she reportedly improvised short melodies to accompany her reflections on letters or news, a practice scholars still debate as either distraction, meditation, or subtle mood regulation. You feel the quiet intimacy of these private sounds, the vibrations blending seamlessly with the muted hum of the palace, creating a soft, almost lullaby-like rhythm. The night grows stiller. Outside, Alexandria glimmers faintly under the moon, the distant lap of water against docked ships, and the occasional flutter of a nocturnal bird forming a gentle background hum. Cleopatra moves toward a private garden, her bare feet brushing over soft stone. Oddly, she reportedly scattered rose petals along paths to subtly guide visitors' attention or simply for personal enjoyment. Scholars still debate the symbolic or practical purpose, but the effect is hypnotic, softening every step you take beside her into rhythm with the quiet night. She pauses by a small fountain, tracing the flow of water with her fingertips. Oddly, she seems fascinated by the tiny ripples, watching how a single drop can create concentric circles that expand outward. Scholars still argue whether her fascination with water was symbolic, aesthetic, or meditative, but the quiet repetition of this observation carries a hypnotic calm, drawing your attention and breath along with the gentle motion. Cleopatra leans lightly on the fountain's edge, inhaling the mixed scents of jasmine, rose, and wet stone. Oddly, she reportedly whispered small private affirmations to herself during these nightly rituals, a blend of practical reflection and soft self-soothing. Scholars still debate whether these were personal meditation, subtle psychological preparation, or ritualistic habit, but in the soft glow of moonlight and lamplight, the effect is undeniably soothing, even for you. You follow her into a private study where small lamps flicker against parchment-strewn tables. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly arranged letters by emotional tone, setting aside messages that pleased her versus those that caused irritation or concern. Scholars still debate whether this was purely psychological management or practical, but you notice the subtle rhythm in her sorting, the gentle cadence of decision-making that is almost hypnotic, a quiet lull of thought and order. The palace grows quieter, shadows deepening, steps softer, voices nearly gone. Cleopatra moves toward a small cushioned alcove, sitting with a final sigh as if releasing the weight of the day. Oddly, she reportedly kept a tiny bowl of scented oil nearby, dipping fingers into it and inhaling deeply to soothe tension. Scholars still argue whether such habits were ritualistic or meditative, but the effect is tangible, a slow, soothing rhythm that gently carries your attention along with her own winding day and night. Finally, you step back, letting the combination of moonlight, soft fragrances, gentle water, and quiet human rituals envelop you. Cleopatra's presence, subtle gestures, and nocturnal rhythms create a delicate, hypnotic tapestry. You feel yourself drifting along with her, caught between history, ritual, and intimacy, carried softly toward the quiet edges of sleep, the whispering cadence of Alexandria, and the subtle, enduring pulse of the Nile. You drift along the palace corridors, the soft glow of flickering lamps casting long shadows that sway gently with every movement. Cleopatra's presence guides you, her calm but deliberate steps creating a rhythm that feels almost hypnotic. The faint scent of jasmine, incense, and distant salt from the Nile lingers in the air, mingling in a perfume that is uniquely Alexandria at night. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra's control over the palace atmosphere was calculated strategy or natural presence, but you don't need to pick sides, you simply let the experience wash over you. You pause at a small alcove where the walls are adorned with mosaics depicting the gods, legendary battles, and victorious kings. Oddly, one figure, a small, nearly hidden sphinx, seems slightly out of place, as if deliberately positioned to catch only observant eyes. Cleopatra traces her finger along the mosaic lines, and you imagine the faintest smile playing across her lips, a private amusement that few could guess. Scholars still debate whether these subtle shifts were symbolic, strategic, or purely aesthetic, but you can't help but be drawn into the quiet intimacy of her attention to detail. The corridors hum with life, though it is a muted, almost secretive rhythm. Servants pass quietly, some carrying trays of water, others delivering scrolls. Oddly, one page carries a small bronze bell, ringing it softly to announce the arrival of messages. Cleopatra glances at the bell with a faint, knowing smile, seemingly amused by the small human rituals that accompany even the weightiest political actions. Scholars still argue how much these domestic habits influence the smooth running of her court, but to you, the minor absurdities are part of the hypnotic charm of the night. You follow her into a private chamber lined with maps of Alexandria and the surrounding kingdoms. Oddly, she reportedly folded corners of maps to indicate areas of particular concern, creating a visual shorthand known only to her and select advisors. Scholars still debate whether this was purely practical or a subtle form of psychological influence on those who glimpsed her planning, but the meticulousness is mesmerizing. You watch as her eyes trace the lines of rivers, hills, and city walls, silently calculating, weighing possibilities, and mentally rehearsing contingencies. Cleopatra pauses by a small window overlooking the Nile. The water gleams silver under the moonlight, rippling gently in rhythm with the night breeze. Oddly, She reportedly had a favorite spot where the reflection of the moon hit the river at just the right angle, and she would linger there for minutes, sometimes lost in thought, sometimes whispering softly to herself. Scholars still debate whether these rituals were symbolic, meditative, or playful indulgences, but you feel the gentle pull of serenity, the soft hypnotic cadence of the night drawing you into calm awareness. You drift into an inner garden, where the faint hum of nocturnal insects blends with the sound of water trickling from a small fountain. Cleopatra moves with measured steps, pausing occasionally to touch the petals of jasmine or lotus flowers. Oddly, she reportedly had tiny, secret paths lined with rose petals to guide late-night visitors or simply for personal delight. Scholars still argue whether these small gestures carried symbolic meaning or were purely sensory pleasures, but their hypnotic repetition draws your attention, wrapping the night in a soft, tactile rhythm. The palace is alive with muted activity, distant voices of servants, footsteps echoing against marble, the rustle of silk robes. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly had a favorite servant who would quietly sing fragments of songs or recite poetry as he moved through the corridors, and she allowed it, finding the small melodies comforting. Scholars still debate whether music and poetry in the palace were primarily entertainment, ritual, or meditative, but you feel the subtle, soothing pulse as these tiny auditory pleasures weave through the quiet hum of the night. You drift with her into a room filled with scrolls, letters, and documents. Cleopatra picks up a small bundle, running her fingers gently along the edges, her eyes scanning carefully. Oddly, she reportedly had a habit of marking letters with tiny, coded symbols that only she could read, indicating priority, tone, or hidden intent. Scholars still argue whether this was purely practical or an early form of psychological influence, but you sense the careful deliberation in every gesture, the rhythm of thought made tangible in her meticulous attention to detail. The night deepens, and you drift along corridors lined with art, sculptures, and ceremonial objects. Oddly, Cleopatra seems to arrange some items just slightly off-kilter, reportedly as a test of visitors' observation or simply for her own amusement. Scholars still debate whether these subtle manipulations were political, aesthetic, or playful, but you feel the hypnotic effect of human quirk and intentionality interwoven, a quiet theater of history unfolding around you. You follow her into a small room where soft cushions and low tables are arranged for late-night councils. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly added tiny bowls of scented oils to calm tempers and sharpen focus during discussions. Scholars still debate whether these were ritualistic, therapeutic, or strategic, but the soft scents mingle with the candlelight, creating a gentle sensory environment that soothes the mind while heightening subtle awareness. A faint breeze drifts through an open window, stirring the curtains and carrying with it the soft scent of night-blooming flowers. Cleopatra pauses briefly, inhaling deeply, then straightens, her attention returning to maps and correspondence. Oddly, she reportedly used the natural movement of air to subtly rearrange notes and small objects on her table, an almost imperceptible blending of environment and intent. Scholars still argue whether this was practical, symbolic, or whimsical, but you feel the gentle rhythm of observation, calculation, and subtle human touch. You drift toward the palace's music room, where Cleopatra plucks a few notes on a lyre, the sound soft and resonant. Oddly, she reportedly improvised melodies to accompany reflection or decision-making, a habit scholars still debate as either distraction, meditation, or subtle psychological regulation. The soft vibrations float through the halls, mingling with distant water sounds, whispers of servants, and the faint murmur of Alexandria sleeping. You feel the hypnotic pull, a gentle lull, and the night's rhythm begins to settle around you like a warm blanket. The night continues, moving slowly, each gesture, each scent, each subtle sound adding layers to the soft tapestry of palace life. Cleopatra pauses in the private garden once more, brushing her fingers along the fountain's edge and watching water ripple outward. Oddly, she reportedly whispered small private affirmations during these moments, a mix of meditation, reflection, and gentle reassurance. Scholars still argue whether these practices were symbolic, ritualistic, or merely personal indulgence, but their hypnotic cadence carries you softly forward, almost imperceptibly edging your mind toward relaxation. Finally, you step back slightly, letting the palace, the soft ripples of water, the quiet scents, and Cleopatra's intimate nocturnal rituals envelop you. You feel her calm presence, the hypnotic rhythm of her steps, gestures, and quiet observations gently drawing you through history, ritual, and human nuance. The night is expansive yet intimate, the city around you quiet, and the distant pulse of the Nile a lullaby threading softly through every shadow, every whispered sound, and every soft breath of the palace air. You wander further into the palace, moving through quiet corridors where the faint flicker of candlelight paints gentle, dancing shadows on the walls. Cleopatra leads you with that effortless presence, each step calm but purposeful, a silent reminder that even in moments of stillness, the weight of power rests heavily upon her shoulders. Scholars still debate whether her composure was innate or meticulously cultivated for appearances, but right now, it's simply mesmerizing, a hypnotic rhythm to follow as the night stretches on. The palace smells faintly of jasmine, sandalwood, and the subtle musk of wax candles. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly sprinkled dried flowers along certain corridors to mark paths, perhaps for herself, perhaps for visitors, tiny rituals invisible to most. You feel your senses tingle slightly as you inhale the mixed scents, a gentle reminder that even the most calculated spaces are alive with small, intimate human touches. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were purely aesthetic or held symbolic meaning, but the hypnotic cadence of scent and shadow quietly anchors you to the unfolding night. You drift into a chamber lined with maps, miniature models of ships, and diagrams of fortifications. Cleopatra leans over a map of Alexandria's harbors, her fingers tracing subtle lines that mark patrol routes and potential escape paths. Oddly, she reportedly kept a small piece of carved ivory near the map, which she would roll between her fingers when pondering difficult decisions. Scholars still debate whether this was a calming ritual or an early form of tactile strategy, but you feel the hypnotic rhythm of thought, the gentle cadence of reflection and calculation echoing softly in the room. Outside, the city is quiet, the distant lap of Nile waters against docked ships and the faint murmurs of nocturnal animals forming a soothing backdrop. Cleopatra steps to a balcony, gazing at the reflection of moonlight shimmering across the water. Oddly, she reportedly favored a particular ripple pattern that occurred near a dock at certain times, claiming it brought clarity to her decisions. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but for you, it becomes a gentle, entrancing focus, a soft tether linking attention and imagination. Inside, the palace hums with muted life. Servants moving softly along corridors, the occasional shuffle of scrolls, the faint murmur of advisors whispering reports. Oddly, one young page carries a small, carved figurine of a cat. Claiming it predicts fortune, Cleopatra notices it, suppressing a smile, perhaps finding amusement in the blend of superstition and service. Scholars still debate the role of such charms in royal decision-making, but the tiny human rituals add texture and rhythm, a hypnotic cadence of whimsy intertwined with immense political gravity. You drift with her into a private garden, where a small fountain trickles softly, the water catching the moonlight in tiny silver sparks. Cleopatra pauses to touch the petals of lotus flowers, inhaling their fragrance with delicate attention. Oddly, she reportedly arranged certain flowers deliberately to guide visitors along subtle paths, a quiet choreography of scent, color, and movement. Scholars still argue whether these practices were symbolic, aesthetic, or meditative, but the hypnotic pattern draws your mind into slow, reflective motion, syncing with the gentle pulse of the garden. The palace feels alive with quiet energy, though it is muted, almost secretive. You notice Cleopatra's meticulous attention to small details. A scroll slightly tilted, a candle flame carefully angled, a cup of water placed just so. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged minor objects in ways that conveyed subtle messages to those who knew her code. Scholars still debate whether these subtle manipulations were strategic, symbolic, or playful, but you sense the hypnotic rhythm in every gesture, the quiet cadence of thought made visible in everyday actions. You drift into a chamber filled with musical instruments, soft rugs, and cushions. Cleopatra plucks a few notes on a lyre, letting the gentle sound float into the surrounding halls. Oddly, she reportedly improvised short melodies to accompany reflection or correspondence, a practice scholars still argue was meditative, strategic, or simply indulgent. You feel the soft vibrations ripple through the palace, mingling with distant water sounds and the hushed murmur of nocturnal life, creating a lullaby-like cadence that wraps around your awareness. The night deepens further. Cleopatra moves to a small alcove where incense burns gently, curling wisps of smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Oddly, she reportedly kept a collection of rare incense blends, each chosen to evoke subtle moods or mental clarity. Scholars still debate whether this was ritualistic, therapeutic, or purely aesthetic, but the hypnotic flow of scent and shadow carries you into a gentle state of calm, your senses attuned to the rhythm of palace life. You notice the soft interplay of shadows and candlelight along the marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a sculpture, tilting it slightly, reportedly to test perception or perhaps amuse herself. Oddly, the sculpture, a small bronze figure of a dancing woman, seems to almost shimmer in the flickering light. Scholars still argue whether such visual games were symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the hypnotic dance of shadow, light, and subtle human gesture captivates your attention, pulling you gently along with her rhythm. You follow her into a quiet library where scrolls and books are stacked in careful order. Cleopatra picks up a parchment, running her fingers along the edges before reading. Oddly, she reportedly folded corners or added tiny marks as subtle cues, a system only she and her aides understood. Scholars still debate whether this was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the careful cadence of attention, reflection, and subtle communication resonates like a gentle pulse, wrapping you in the hypnotic rhythm of intellectual precision. Outside, the Nile flows silently, reflecting the moon's glow, while Alexandria rests under the cover of night. Cleopatra glances toward the horizon, her eyes tracing distant lights that may signify approaching ships, merchant vessels, or the quiet stirrings of the city. Oddly, she reportedly had a favorite pattern of reflection on the water, claiming it aided clarity in decisions. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect on you is undeniable, a gentle tether linking observation, history, and imagination in hypnotic flow. Finally, you drift back slightly, letting the palace, the soft ripples of water, the muted scents, and Cleopatra's intimate nocturnal rituals envelop you. Each gesture, each small indulgence, and every subtle calculation creates a layered, hypnotic tapestry that is simultaneously human, strategic, and serene. You feel yourself caught between the grand sweep of history and the delicate intimacy of private life, lulled by the gentle cadence of Alexandria's quiet night, the soft pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's careful, mesmerizing presence. You drift further into the palace, following Cleopatra through corridors that seem to stretch endlessly, their soft stone walls catching candlelight in warm, flickering patterns. The night feels suspended in time, a delicate stillness broken only by the distant lap of the Nile against its banks and the occasional rustle of a nocturnal animal. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra's ability to maintain calm during these hours was instinctive or learned discipline, but for now, you simply let yourself be carried along, tracing her careful, measured movements. The corridors are scented faintly with a mixture of jasmine, myrrh, and a trace of burning wax. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly had small sachets of herbs tucked into corners of rooms, not for fragrance alone, but as a subtle mental cue, reminders of duties, alliances, or personal moments. Scholars still debate whether these were symbolic, practical, or a private form of psychological anchoring, but you feel the hypnotic rhythm of scent, shadow, and ritual wrap softly around your attention. She pauses in a chamber filled with scrolls, maps, and miniature models of fleets. Cleopatra leans over a map of Alexandria's harbors, tracing the delicate lines with her fingers. Oddly, she reportedly used small carved markers to indicate troop movements, shipping routes, or areas of strategic concern. Scholars still argue whether this was tactical planning, ritualistic habit, or a mix of both, but you sense the quiet, methodical rhythm behind each careful movement, a pulse that almost seems to echo the gentle flow of the Nile itself. The city outside sleeps under a silver moon, distant fires flickering along docks or in private homes. Cleopatra moves to a balcony, gazing at the water as if weighing the city's secrets against the larger currents of her empire. Oddly, she reportedly had a favored reflection in the river, a specific shimmer in the moonlight that she claimed brought clarity to her decisions. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition, meditation, or an aesthetic preference, but for you, it becomes a quiet anchor, a hypnotic tether between observation and reflection. Inside, the palace hums softly with muted life. Servants move quietly along the halls, their footsteps blending with the faint rustle of robes and the occasional clink of small objects being moved. Oddly, one page carries a small bronze figurine, a cat, they say, that predicts fortune. Cleopatra glances at it, hiding a faint smile, perhaps amused by the blend of superstition and ceremony in daily life. Scholars still argue whether charms influenced decision-making or merely comforted the courtiers, but the rhythm of ritual and subtle human quirk is hypnotic in its gentle consistency. You drift with her into a private garden, where the fountain's gentle trickle merges with the soft murmur of nighttime insects. Cleopatra moves deliberately, brushing fingers over lotus flowers, inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly scattered petals along hidden paths to guide visitors or simply for personal delight. Scholars still debate whether these gestures were symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of tactile sensation, fragrance, and moonlit movement draws your attention, your own senses aligning with the quiet rhythm. The palace feels alive, yet intimate. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to details, tilted scrolls, angled candle flames, precisely placed objects, creates a soft, hypnotic pattern. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged items subtly to communicate private messages to her aides, gestures invisible to most. Scholars still argue whether these micro-adjustments were strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the effect on you is mesmerizing, an intimate rhythm of awareness, observation, and subtle intent. You drift into a music chamber. Cleopatra plucks a lyre, allowing gentle notes to float into the room, mingling with distant water sounds and murmurs of palace life. Oddly, she reportedly improvised melodies in response to letters or news, a habit scholars still debate as either meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The vibrations ripple softly, creating a lullaby-like cadence that entwines with the muted life of Alexandria at night, carrying you gently along. The night deepens further. Cleopatra lights a small incense burner, watching smoke curl toward the ceiling. Oddly, she reportedly had rare blends she saved for moments of reflection or decision, the scents chosen for subtle psychological effect. Scholars still debate whether this was ritualistic, aesthetic, or therapeutic, but the hypnotic flow of fragrance, shadow, and soft light draws you deeper into calm observation, your own thoughts slowing in tandem. You notice subtle plays of shadow and light on the marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a small bronze sculpture of a dancer, tilting it slightly to observe the shifting shadows. Oddly, she reportedly used these small adjustments to test perception, amuse herself, or simply engage in quiet reflection. Scholars still argue whether these acts were symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the hypnotic interplay of light, shadow, and human nuance draws your attention irresistibly, softening your focus. You drift into a quiet library where scrolls and letters are stacked in meticulous order. Cleopatra picks up a parchment, running her fingers along the edges before reading. Oddly, she reportedly folded corners or added tiny marks to indicate priority, tone, or subtle context, a system only she and trusted aides understood. Scholars still debate whether this was practical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of attention, deliberation, and coded gesture resonates gently, wrapping you in hypnotic cadence. Outside, Alexandria rests beneath a moonlit sky. Cleopatra glances toward the distant horizon, noting the shimmer of ships and city lights. Oddly, she reportedly had favorite patterns of moonlight reflections she found clarifying or inspiring. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect is hypnotic, a gentle anchor linking reflection, perception, and soft awareness of history unfolding around you. Finally, you step back slightly, letting the palace, the soft water, muted scents, and Cleopatra's nocturnal rituals envelop you. Every gesture, every subtle indulgence, Every quiet calculation creates a layered, hypnotic tapestry that is human, strategic, and serene. You feel suspended between history and intimacy, lulled by the gentle cadence of Alexandria's quiet night, the soft pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's careful, mesmerizing presence. You wander deeper into the palace, the quiet echo of your steps merging with the soft murmur of the Nile outside. Cleopatra leads the way, her presence commanding yet effortless, a rhythm you find yourself naturally sinking to. Scholars still debate whether her serene composure during these final days was strategic mastery or instinctive grace, but for you, it's mesmerizing, a subtle cadence that pulls you forward into the hushed world of her nocturnal rituals. The air is thick with mixed fragrances, faint jasmine, warm incense, and the soft musk of wax candles burning low. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly scattered dried herbs in certain hallways, their purpose a mix of scent, ritual, and psychological anchoring. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, meditative, or purely aesthetic, but you inhale deeply, letting the hypnotic rhythm of scent, shadow, and muted movement lull you into attentive calm. You drift into a chamber filled with scrolls, miniature models of fleets, and maps of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra leans over a chart of Alexandria's harbors, tracing lines that mark potential patrol routes, trade paths, or escape strategies. Oddly, she reportedly kept a tiny carved ivory piece nearby, rolling it between her fingers when considering difficult decisions. Scholars still debate whether this was a meditative habit or strategic aid, but you feel the hypnotic cadence of thought and reflection, a soft echo of the river's current threading through her careful calculations. Outside, Alexandria rests beneath a silvered sky. Moonlight glimmers on the Nile, the rippling reflections catching your attention as Cleopatra pauses on a balcony, her gaze lingering on the gentle shimmer. Oddly, she reportedly favored a particular pattern of reflection that she claimed brought clarity or perspective. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but for you, it becomes an anchor, a hypnotic point tying observation and reflection into the quiet rhythm of the night. Inside, the palace hums with subtle life. Servants move with muted efficiency, carrying trays, letters, or small ornaments along quiet corridors. Oddly, one page carries a small bronze cat figurine, believed to predict fortune. Cleopatra glances at it and suppresses a faint smile, amused by superstition interlaced with daily routine. Scholars still debate whether charms like this influenced decisions or comforted courtiers, but you feel the hypnotic pulse of ritual, whimsy, and human rhythm intertwined with the solemn weight of history. You drift with her into a garden where a small fountain trickles, its gentle sound blending with the hum of nocturnal insects. Cleopatra moves deliberately, brushing her fingers along lotus petals, inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly arranged petals along hidden paths, subtly guiding visitors or indulging herself in quiet beauty. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of tactile sensation and moonlit observation draws your mind into soft, reflective rhythm. The palace feels simultaneously alive and intimate. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to details, tilted scrolls, angled candle flames, carefully placed objects, creates a soft, hypnotic pattern. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged items to communicate subtle messages to her aides, gestures invisible to most. Scholars still debate whether these adjustments were strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the effect is mesmerizing, an intimate rhythm of awareness and subtle intention that gently carries you along. You drift into a music room. Cleopatra plucks a lyre, the soft notes floating through the halls and mingling with distant water sounds, whispers of servants, and the faint rustle of silk. Oddly, she reportedly improvised short melodies to accompany reflection, correspondence, or even news she received, a habit scholars still debate as meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The sound vibrates gently through the palace, weaving a soft, lullaby-like cadence that cocoons your attention and slows the pulse of time. The night deepens. Cleopatra lights a small incense burner, watching smoke curl and drift upward. Oddly, she reportedly kept rare blends for quiet contemplation, each chosen for subtle psychological or sensory effect. Scholars still debate whether this was ritualistic, therapeutic, or purely aesthetic, but the hypnotic interplay of fragrance, shadow, and faint illumination draws you deeper into gentle, reflective awareness. You notice the soft dance of shadows on marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a bronze figure of a dancer, tilting it slightly to watch how the flickering candlelight transforms its form. Oddly, she reportedly used small adjustments to test perception, amuse herself, or engage in quiet reflection. Scholars still argue whether these were symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the gentle rhythm of light, shadow, and human nuance commands your attention, softening focus and drawing you along. You drift into a library where scrolls and letters are stacked with careful order. Cleopatra runs her fingers along a parchment, folding corners and marking edges with tiny symbols, a code only she and trusted aides can read. Scholars still debate whether this was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of thought, reflection, and coded gesture forms a gentle pulse, wrapping you in a hypnotic flow. Outside, the Nile flows silently beneath the moonlight. Cleopatra gazes toward distant lights, noting reflections of ships and subtle city glimmers. Oddly, she reportedly favored certain patterns of reflection that brought mental clarity. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect on you is hypnotic, a soft anchor connecting reflection, observation, and awareness of history. Finally, you step back slightly, letting the palace, soft water sounds, muted scents, and Cleopatra's nocturnal rituals envelop you. Every gesture, indulgence, and calculation creates a layered, hypnotic tapestry that is human, strategic, and serene. You are suspended between the sweep of history and intimate life, lulled by the gentle cadence of Alexandria's quiet night, the pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's mesmerizing presence. You drift down a corridor where the night light dances softly across polished stone walls, guiding you deeper into the quiet heart of the palace. Cleopatra's presence feels like a magnetic rhythm, each step deliberate yet almost effortless, as if she is in perfect sync with the whispering pulse of Alexandria itself. Scholars still argue whether her calm during these late nights was natural temperament or the result of deliberate practice, but for now, you let yourself be swept along, captivated by her hypnotic cadence. The air smells faintly of jasmine, honeyed wax, and a trace of river mud carried from the Nile breeze. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly tucked small bundles of fragrant herbs in corners of chambers, their purpose both practical and symbolic, reminders of important events, emotional cues, or quiet comfort. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic choice, but you inhale slowly, letting the layered aromas anchor your senses and draw you into the rhythm of her nocturnal world. You drift into a small study lined with scrolls, maps, and miniature models of fleets and fortresses. Cleopatra bends over a chart, fingers tracing routes of ships, possible landing points, and potential defensive positions. Oddly, she reportedly used tiny carved markers to denote specific priorities or hidden risks. Scholars still argue whether this was strategic, meditative, or ritualistic, but you feel the hypnotic pulse in her measured gestures, the quiet cadence of thought flowing through each deliberate movement. Outside, Alexandria lies beneath a silvered sky. The moonlight catches the Nile, creating a trembling pattern that dances across the water's surface. Cleopatra pauses on a balcony, her eyes following the shimmer, reportedly favoring certain reflections that she felt helped clarify decisions. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but for you, it becomes a soft anchor, a hypnotic tether drawing attention to the gentle rhythm of light and motion. Inside, the palace hums faintly with human activity. Servants glide along corridors, carrying trays, letters, or ornaments, their soft movements blending with the rustle of robes and the distant drip of water from fountains. Oddly, one page carries a bronze cat figurine, reputed to predict fortune. Cleopatra's faint smile at its presence speaks to a quiet amusement with superstition and ceremony. Scholars still debate the influence of such charms on decision-making, but you feel the gentle rhythm of ritual, whimsy, and human nuance intertwined with political gravity. You drift into a private garden, where the fountain trickles in a soothing rhythm, blending with the distant hum of nighttime insects. Cleopatra moves deliberately, brushing her fingers across lotus petals and inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly arranged flowers along hidden paths to guide visitors or indulge her own sense of beauty. Scholars still argue whether these gestures were symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of tactile sensation and moonlit observation draws your attention, syncing your breathing to the slow rhythm of the garden. The palace feels alive yet intimate. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to minor details, angled scrolls, precisely placed candles, small ornaments shifted with intention, creates a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged objects to convey hidden messages to trusted aides, gestures invisible to most. Scholars still debate whether these were strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the quiet cadence of observation, reflection, and subtle communication envelops you in its soft hypnotic pull. You drift into a music chamber. Cleopatra plucks a lyre, letting gentle notes float into the surrounding halls, mixing with distant water sounds and the faint rustle of night. Oddly, she reportedly improvised short melodies to accompany letters or news, a habit scholars still debate as meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The vibrations ripple softly, creating a lullaby-like cadence that intertwines with the muted pulse of Alexandria at night, slowing your thoughts in gentle harmony. The night deepens. Cleopatra lights a small incense burner, watching smoke spiral and drift upward. Oddly, she reportedly had rare blends reserved for private reflection, each chosen to subtly affect mood or focus. Scholars still debate whether this was ritualistic, therapeutic, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic dance of scent, shadow, and candlelight draws you further into calm, reflective awareness. You notice how shadows stretch and contract on the marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a bronze figure of a dancer, tilting it to observe shifting light patterns. Oddly, she reportedly used these small adjustments to test perception, entertain herself, or encourage quiet reflection. Scholars still debate whether these were symbolic, aesthetic, or playful gestures, but the hypnotic interplay of light, shadow, and human subtlety captures your attention and softens focus. You drift into the library, where scrolls are stacked with careful precision. Cleopatra fingers a parchment, folding corners and adding tiny coded marks, a system only she and trusted aides understand. Scholars still debate whether this was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of attention, reflection, and subtle communication forms a gentle, hypnotic pulse that wraps around your senses. Outside, Alexandria is quiet beneath a silver sky. Cleopatra watches distant lights flicker across the city and the river, noting subtle reflections of ships and moonlit ripples. Oddly, she reportedly favored patterns that seemed clarifying or inspiring. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the hypnotic effect is undeniable, a soft anchor linking attention, reflection, and history in quiet alignment. Finally, you step back, letting the palace, soft water sounds, muted fragrances, and Cleopatra's intimate nightly rituals envelop you. Each gesture, indulgence, and calculation creates a layered, hypnotic tapestry, human, strategic, and serene. You drift suspended between history and intimacy, lulled by the gentle cadence of Alexandria's night, the pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's quietly commanding presence. You wander further into the heart of the palace, where the stone floors glisten faintly under candlelight, and the air is thick with the soft hum of nocturnal life. Cleopatra moves ahead of you, her steps measured, each one carrying a rhythm you find yourself unconsciously matching. Scholars still argue whether her calm in these late hours was instinct or deliberate mastery, but for now, you simply let yourself be drawn into the hypnotic flow of her presence, drifting with the subtle pulse of Alexandria's night. The corridors are fragrant with the soft scent of jasmine, sandalwood, and faint smoke from the low-burning candles. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly tucked small sachets of herbs in hidden corners of certain chambers, a practice some scholars suggest was symbolic, meditative, or psychological. You inhale slowly, letting the blend of aromas draw your senses into quiet attentiveness, syncing with the measured rhythm of palace life. Scholars still debate the purpose, but the effect on you is hypnotic, a gentle, invisible thread pulling you deeper into the night. You enter a chamber lined with scrolls, miniature fleet models, and intricate maps of the Mediterranean coastline. Cleopatra bends over a chart of Alexandria's harbors, her fingers tracing trade routes, patrols, and possible escape points. Oddly, she reportedly kept a small carved piece of ivory nearby, rolling it in her fingers while considering the logistics of movement and defense. Scholars still argue whether this was a meditative habit, strategic tool, or ritualistic gesture, but you feel the slow pulse of thought behind every meticulous motion, a quiet cadence that mirrors the ebb and flow of the Nile. Outside, Alexandria rests beneath a silvered moon. Cleopatra pauses on a balcony, watching the river's gentle shimmer, reportedly favoring specific patterns of reflection she believed clarified her decisions. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but for you, the rippling moonlight becomes a hypnotic anchor, a quiet pulse connecting observation, reflection, and the subtle rhythm of time. Inside, the palace is alive with soft, muted activity. Servants move with quiet efficiency, carrying trays, scrolls, and ornaments, blending into the soft hum of human presence. Oddly, one page carries a small bronze cat figurine said to predict fortune. Cleopatra notices it and suppresses a faint, knowing smile, amused by the mix of superstition, ceremony, and the gentle human quirks that persist even in great halls. Scholars still debate the significance of charms, but the hypnotic pulse of ritual and whimsy persists in the quiet cadence of palace life. You drift into a garden where fountains murmur softly, merging with the faint chirping of insects. Cleopatra walks deliberately along hidden paths, brushing fingers across lotus petals and inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly scattered petals in deliberate patterns, either as guides for visitors or as indulgent pleasure for herself. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of tactile sensation, scent, and moonlight pulls you gently into reflective calm, syncing your awareness with the subtle rhythm of her movements. The palace feels intimate, alive in its subtle orchestrations. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to small details, tilted scrolls, angled candles, objects shifted ever so slightly, creates a soft, hypnotic rhythm. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged objects to communicate subtle, private messages to her aides. Scholars still debate whether these gestures were strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the effect is mesmerizing, a quiet cadence of observation and intention that carries you effortlessly along. You drift into a music room. Cleopatra plucks a lyre, letting notes float softly through the halls, blending with distant water sounds and the faint stir of servants. Oddly, she reportedly improvised melodies in response to letters, news, or even moods, a practice scholars still debate as meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The vibrations ripple gently, creating a lullaby-like cadence that merges seamlessly with Alexandria's muted nocturnal heartbeat, slowing your thoughts into gentle alignment. The night deepens. Cleopatra lights an incense burner, watching smoke spiral and curl toward the ceiling. Oddly, she reportedly reserved rare blends for private reflection, each chosen to subtly influence mood and focus. Scholars still debate whether this was ritualistic, therapeutic, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic play of scent, shadow, and soft illumination draws you deeper into relaxed awareness, your mind synchronizing with the slow rhythm of the palace. You notice the interplay of light and shadow along the marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a bronze sculpture of a dancer, tilting it slightly to watch shadows shift with candlelight. Oddly, she reportedly used these small gestures to test perception, amuse herself, or encourage reflection. Scholars still debate whether they were symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the hypnotic dance of light, shadow, and human subtlety captures your attention, softening focus as you drift along. You move into a library where scrolls are stacked with meticulous care. Cleopatra picks up a parchment, tracing the edges and folding corners, adding tiny coded marks, messages only she and trusted aides can decipher. Scholars still argue whether this practice was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of attention, reflection, and coded gesture forms a hypnotic pulse, gently wrapping your senses. Outside, the Nile reflects moonlight across the sleeping city. Cleopatra observes distant lights flicker on the horizon, noting the subtle glimmer of ships and water patterns. Oddly, she reportedly favored reflections she believed offered clarity or inspiration. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect is hypnotic, a soft anchor tying observation, reflection, and historical presence together. Finally, you step back slightly, letting the palace, soft water sounds, subtle fragrances, and Cleopatra's intimate nightly rituals envelop you. Each gesture, indulgence, and calculation layers a hypnotic tapestry, human, strategic, serene. You feel suspended between history and intimacy, lulled by the gentle cadence of Alexandria's quiet night, the pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's quietly commanding presence. You wander deeper into the palace, your steps soft against polished marble floors, the faint flicker of candlelight creating shadows that twist and stretch across the walls. Cleopatra glides ahead, her movements smooth, almost musical, as if she is dancing to a rhythm only she can hear. Scholars still debate whether her calm and elegance in these final nights was natural temperament or the result of deliberate training, but for now, you simply follow, mesmerized by the hypnotic cadence of her presence. The air carries subtle scents, jasmine, myrrh, and the soft undertone of warm wax. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly kept small pouches of herbs tucked in hidden nooks, their purpose a blend of comfort, symbolism, and perhaps ritualistic meditation. Scholars still argue whether these gestures were practical, spiritual, or aesthetic, but you inhale deeply, letting the aromas anchor your senses and lull you into calm attentiveness. You enter a study filled with scrolls, maps, and tiny models of ships and fortifications. Cleopatra leans over a chart of Alexandria's harbors, tracing trade routes, patrol paths, and possible escape points. Oddly, she reportedly kept a small carved piece of ivory, rolling it between her fingers while contemplating strategy or correspondence. Scholars still debate whether this was meditative habit, strategic planning, or ceremonial ritual, but the quiet cadence of her gestures feels hypnotic, echoing the gentle pulse of the Nile outside. Outside, Alexandria sleeps beneath a silvered moon. Cleopatra pauses on a balcony, watching the water's gentle shimmer. Oddly, she reportedly favored certain ripple patterns, claiming they helped her focus or clarify her thoughts. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the reflection becomes a soft anchor, drawing your attention into the slow rhythm of observation and reflection. Inside, the palace hums faintly with quiet activity. Servants glide along corridors, carrying trays, scrolls, and ornaments, their movements blending seamlessly into the soft murmur of night. Oddly, one young page carries a bronze cat figurine, set to predict fortune. Cleopatra notices it, suppressing a faint smile, amused by the interplay of superstition and daily ritual. Scholars still debate whether charms influenced decision-making or merely comforted courtiers, but the gentle rhythm of ritual and whimsy persists, a subtle heartbeat beneath the palace's grand structure. You drift into a garden where the fountain's soft trickle merges with the night's ambient sounds, distant insects, gentle wind, and water lapping against stone. Cleopatra moves along hidden paths, brushing her fingers across lotus petals and inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly scattered petals to guide visitors subtly or simply to indulge herself. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of scent, touch, and moonlit reflection draws your attention, aligning your senses with the slow rhythm of the garden. The palace feels alive, intimate in its orchestration. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to minor details, tilted scrolls, carefully angled candle flames, delicately arranged objects, creates a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged items to convey private messages to aides. Scholars still debate whether this was strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the quiet cadence of observation and intention envelops you, guiding you through the soft flow of the night. You drift into a music chamber, where Cleopatra plucks a lyre, the notes floating gently through the halls. Oddly, she reportedly improvised melodies to accompany letters, news, or personal reflection, a habit scholars still debate as meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The vibrations ripple through the palace, merging with water sounds and muted life, creating a lullaby-like cadence that slows your thoughts into gentle alignment. The night deepens further. Cleopatra lights an incense burner, watching smoke curl and twist toward the ceiling. Oddly, she reportedly kept rare blends for private contemplation, each selected for subtle psychological or aesthetic effect. Scholars still debate whether this was ritual, therapy, or pure indulgence, but the hypnotic flow of scent, shadow, and soft light draws you deeper into relaxed observation. You notice the gentle dance of shadows on marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a bronze sculpture of a dancer, tilting it slightly to watch shifting patterns. Oddly, she reportedly used these gestures to amuse herself, test perception, or encourage quiet reflection. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the hypnotic interplay of light, shadow, and human subtlety captivates your attention, softening your focus. You drift into a library where scrolls are stacked meticulously. Cleopatra fingers a parchment, folding corners and adding coded marks, a system only she and trusted aides understood. Scholars still debate whether this was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of attention, reflection, and coded gestures forms a gentle, hypnotic pulse that wraps around your senses. Outside, Alexandria rests beneath the moon's silver glow. Cleopatra observes distant lights flicker across the city and river, noting reflections of ships and water patterns. Oddly, she reportedly favored certain reflections she found clarifying or inspiring. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect is hypnotic, a soft anchor linking awareness, reflection, and historical presence. Finally, you step back, letting the palace, soft water sounds, muted scents, and Cleopatra's private nightly rituals envelop you. Every gesture, indulgence, and calculation layers a hypnotic tapestry, human, strategic, serene. You drift suspended between the grand sweep of history and intimate, private life, lulled by Alexandria's quiet night, the pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's quietly commanding presence. You drift further into the hushed depths of the palace, where candlelight flickers softly along polished stone walls and shadows stretch in slow, deliberate patterns. Cleopatra moves ahead of you, her steps precise yet fluid, almost as if the palace itself bends gently to her rhythm. Scholars still debate whether her calm composure during these final nights was instinctive or the result of careful training, but for now, you simply let yourself follow, drawn into the hypnotic cadence of her presence. The air is thick with a delicate blend of jasmine, sandalwood, and a faint trace of incense smoke curling from low-burning candles. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly tucked small sachets of fragrant herbs in hidden corners, both for comfort and subtle psychological reinforcement. Scholars still argue whether these gestures were symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but you inhale slowly, letting the layered aromas anchor your attention and soften your racing thoughts. You wander into a chamber lined with scrolls, maps, and miniature ship models. Cleopatra leans over a map of Alexandria's harbors, tracing trade routes, patrol paths, and possible points of retreat with meticulous care. Oddly, she reportedly kept a small ivory piece nearby, rolling it between her fingers while contemplating correspondence or strategy. Scholars still debate whether this was meditative, ritualistic, or a practical tool, but the quiet pulse of concentration in her gestures draws your attention, echoing the gentle current of the Nile outside. Outside, the city lies under a silvered sky, the moon glinting off the water. Cleopatra pauses on a balcony, watching the ripples, reportedly favoring certain patterns she claimed clarified her thoughts. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the reflection becomes a gentle anchor, linking observation, reflection, and the hypnotic rhythm of night. Inside, the palace hums quietly with human life. Servants glide silently along corridors, carrying scrolls, trays, or ornaments, their footsteps blending with distant water sounds and the faint rustle of silk robes. Oddly, one page carries a bronze cat figurine reputed to predict fortune. Cleopatra notices it, a faint smile playing across her lips, amused by superstition intertwined with ceremony. Scholars still debate the significance of such charms, but the gentle rhythm of ritual and human quirk persists beneath the grand architecture. You drift into a garden where fountains murmur softly, merging with the subtle chorus of nocturnal insects. Cleopatra moves along hidden paths, brushing her fingers across lotus petals and inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly arranged petals along certain paths to guide visitors or simply indulge herself. Scholars still argue whether these gestures were symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of tactile sensation, scent, and moonlit observation aligns your senses with the quiet rhythm of her movements. The palace feels simultaneously alive and intimate. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to minor details, tilted scrolls, angled candles, objects shifted with intention, creates a soft, hypnotic pattern. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged objects to send subtle messages to her aides, gestures invisible to most. Scholars still debate whether these adjustments were strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the gentle cadence of observation, reflection, and intention envelops you, pulling you along the flow of the night. You drift into a music chamber. Cleopatra plucks a lyre, letting soft notes fill the room, mingling with distant water sounds and faint activity elsewhere in the palace. Oddly, she reportedly improvised melodies in response to letters, news, or moods, a habit scholars still debate as meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The vibrations ripple gently, creating a lullaby-like cadence that slows your thoughts and merges with Alexandria's nocturnal heartbeat. The night deepens further. Cleopatra lights an incense burner, watching smoke curl and rise. Oddly, she reportedly reserved rare blends for quiet contemplation, each chosen to subtly affect mood and focus. Scholars still debate whether this was ritual, therapeutic, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic interplay of scent, shadow, and flickering light draws you deeper into calm, reflective awareness. You notice how shadows stretch and contract along the marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a bronze dancer sculpture, tilting it slightly to observe shifting light patterns. Oddly, she reportedly used these gestures to amuse herself, test perception, or encourage reflection. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the gentle dance of light, shadow, and human nuance captivates you, softening focus and drawing you into the subtle rhythm of the palace. You drift into a library, where scrolls and letters are stacked with meticulous care. Cleopatra fingers a parchment, folding corners and adding tiny coded marks, a system only she and trusted aides understood. Scholars still debate whether this was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of attention, reflection, and coded gestures forms a hypnotic pulse that gently wraps around your senses. Outside, Alexandria rests beneath the silver moon. Cleopatra watches distant lights flicker across the city and river, noting subtle reflections of ships and water patterns. Oddly, she reportedly favored certain reflections she believed brought clarity or inspiration. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect is hypnotic, a soft anchor connecting awareness, reflection, and historical presence. Finally, you step back slightly, letting the palace, soft water sounds, faint fragrances, and Cleopatra's intimate nightly rituals envelop you. Every gesture, indulgence, and careful decision layers a hypnotic tapestry, human, strategic, serene. You drift suspended between history and private life, lulled by the gentle cadence of Alexandria's quiet night, the pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's quietly commanding presence. You wander into the quietest corners of the palace now, where the echoes of your steps are barely perceptible and the soft candlelight flickers across walls adorned with faded murals and gilded frames. Cleopatra glides ahead, her presence calm, almost magnetic, drawing you along the rhythm of the night. Scholars still debate whether her serenity in these final days was innate or honed through years of meticulous self-discipline, but for you, it feels hypnotic, the perfect lullaby of history in motion. The air carries a medley of scents, lingering jasmine, a whisper of sandalwood, and the faint trace of incense curling from a low burner. Oddly, Cleopatra reportedly kept tiny sachets of herbs in hidden corners of the palace, their presence intended for comfort, ritual, or reflection. Scholars still argue whether these were spiritual, aesthetic, or practical gestures, but for now, you inhale slowly, letting the gentle fragrances anchor your attention and calm your senses. You drift into a small study filled with scrolls, maps, and miniature ship models. Cleopatra bends over a chart of Alexandria's harbors, tracing patrol routes, trade paths, and points of potential escape. Oddly, she reportedly kept a carved ivory piece at hand, rolling it between her fingers while weighing decisions. Scholars still debate whether this was meditative, ceremonial, or strategic, but you feel the hypnotic rhythm of her attention, the slow cadence of thought flowing like the Nile outside. Outside, Alexandria glimmers under the silver moon. Cleopatra pauses on a balcony, observing the rippling water. Oddly, she reportedly favored particular patterns of reflection, claiming they clarified her mind. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but for you, the river's soft shimmer becomes a gentle anchor, linking observation, reflection, and the hypnotic cadence of night. Inside, the palace hums faintly. Servants move silently along corridors, carrying scrolls, trays, and ornaments. Oddly, one page carries a bronze cat figurine, set to predict fortune. Cleopatra notices it, a faint smile playing across her lips, amused by superstition mingled with ceremony. Scholars still debate whether such charms influenced decisions or comforted courtiers, but the subtle rhythm of ritual and human quirks pulses quietly beneath the palace's grandeur. You wander into the garden where fountains murmur softly, mingling with nocturnal insect calls. Cleopatra walks along hidden paths, brushing her fingers across lotus petals and inhaling their fragrance. Oddly, she reportedly scattered petals to guide visitors subtly or simply for her own indulgence. Scholars still argue whether these gestures were symbolic, meditative, or aesthetic, but the hypnotic cadence of touch, scent, and moonlit reflection draws your attention into slow, reflective calm. The palace feels alive yet intimate. Cleopatra's meticulous attention to details, tilted scrolls, angled candle flames, carefully shifted objects, creates a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. Oddly, she reportedly rearranged items to communicate private messages to aides. Scholars still debate whether this was strategic, playful, or ritualistic, but the cadence of observation and subtle intention envelops you, pulling you into the night's quiet flow. You drift into a music chamber where Cleopatra plucks a lyre, soft notes floating and mingling with the muted pulse of the palace. Oddly, she reportedly improvised melodies to accompany correspondence, news, or moods, a habit scholars still debate as meditative, strategic, or indulgent. The vibrations ripple through the rooms, blending with water sounds and faint human activity, creating a lullaby-like cadence that slows your thoughts into gentle alignment. The night deepens further. Cleopatra lights an incense burner, watching smoke curl and rise. Oddly, she reportedly reserved rare blends for private contemplation, each chosen to subtly affect mood or focus. Scholars still debate whether this was ritual, therapy, or aesthetic indulgence, but the hypnotic interplay of scent, shadow, and soft illumination draws you deeper into reflective calm. You notice shadows stretching and contracting on marble floors. Cleopatra pauses by a bronze dancer sculpture, tilting it to watch shifting patterns. Oddly, she reportedly used these gestures to amuse herself, test perception, or encourage reflection. Scholars still debate whether this was symbolic, aesthetic, or playful, but the dance of light, shadow, and subtle human nuance softens your focus and lulls your attention. You drift into the library where scrolls and letters are stacked with meticulous care. Cleopatra fingers a parchment, folding corners and adding coded marks, messages only she and trusted aides understood. Scholars still debate whether this was tactical, symbolic, or ritualistic, but the rhythm of attention, reflection, and coded gestures forms a gentle pulse, wrapping around your senses and slowing the cadence of your thoughts. Outside, Alexandria rests beneath the silver moon. Cleopatra observes distant lights flicker across the city and river, noting reflections of ships and ripples. Oddly, she reportedly favored certain reflections that inspired clarity or insight. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition, meditation, or aesthetic preference, but the effect is hypnotic, a soft anchor connecting observation, reflection, and presence in history. Finally, you pause, letting the palace, soft water sounds, faint fragrances, and Cleopatra's nightly rituals envelop you. Every gesture, indulgence, and careful calculation layers a hypnotic tapestry, human, strategic, serene. You drift suspended between the grand sweep of history and intimate, private moments, lulled by the quiet cadence of Alexandria's night, the pulse of the Nile, and Cleopatra's quietly commanding presence. You lie back in your mind's eye, letting the palace fade slowly around you. The soft trickle of fountains, the distant murmur of the Nile, and the muted flicker of candlelight merge into a gentle hum that carries you toward rest. Cleopatra's presence, calm and deliberate, becomes a soothing rhythm, guiding your thoughts to quiet, reflective spaces. Imagine the delicate fragrance of jasmine and incense mingling with the cool night air, drawing every tight muscle in your body into gentle relaxation. Shadows stretch lazily across walls, folding themselves into the soft embrace of night. The subtle vibrations of music, water, and whispered steps ripple through the palace, lulling your mind into a tender, floating stillness. Even the smallest details, the tilt of a scroll, the placement of petals, the shimmer of moonlight on the river, become gentle anchors, threads connecting your awareness to a serene, timeless rhythm. You are suspended between history and the intimate world Cleopatra has crafted around herself, drifting in the delicate cadence of Alexandria's nocturnal pulse. Let your thoughts slow, sinking with the soft ebb and flow of water, the distant rustle of silk, and the calm presence of someone who lived and ruled with deliberate, hypnotic grace. Feel yourself letting go of the day, surrendering to the night, and embracing the gentle lull of history cradling you in its quiet wisdom. Whisper to yourself, you are safe, the world is soft, and time slows. Drift with it, let your mind float on this gentle river of memory and reflection, and surrender to the soft embrace of sleep. Sweet dreams.